Welcome, and thank you for joining us at the conversation produced by the New York State Writers Institute at the University at Albany. My name is Paul Grondahl. I'm the director of the Writers Institute. Before I introduce today's guest, narrative history writer Russell Shorto, let me remind you that this and all of our author interviews are archived on the New York State Writers Institute YouTube channel. You can also find us on nyswritersinstitute.org, our website. And please, you can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram to keep up on everything we have going on here at the Writers Institute. And if you want to support this kind of programming, go to our website, nyswritersinstitute.org, and it's very easy to leave a donation if you'd like to. We'd greatly appreciate that. Now, let me say a few words about our guest, Russell Shorto. I met Russell probably about 20 years ago at the New York State Library in Albany, and he was doing research on a book. He was working with and getting assistance from Charlie Gehring of the New Netherland Project. Charlie has devoted his lifetime to translating and understanding 17th century Dutch manuscripts in the State Library's special collections. A few years later, I met Russell again when he came to Albany to talk about that book, The Island at the Center of the World, the epic story of Dutch Manhattan and the forgotten colony that shaped America. It was not only a critical and commercial success, but his book completely reshaped and reordered our thinking and knowledge of the role of Dutch in colonial America and the settlement of New York City, Albany, and beyond. He followed up that monumental narrative history with three more books of history: Descartes' Bones, Amsterdam, and Revolution Song. And now, for his seventh book, Shorto has taken on a completely different challenge. As he said, this book, titled Smalltime, A Story of My Family and the Mob, enters wholly uncharted territory for him. Using his extraordinary skills as a historian and a prose stylist, he has produced an absorbing personal story about his namesake, his grandfather, Russell Shorto, the minor league mobster of Johnstown, Pennsylvania. As Shorto writes, researching this book, quote, took me into a netherworld of bookies and payoffs, of America in its mid-century brawn, and into the heart and soul of my family. The book has already been winning rave reviews and high praise in places like the New York Times Book Review, which said Shorto, quote, steers us along with his usual humor and eye for quirky detail. And the Wall Street Journal said, Mr. Shorto is a terrific storyteller, especially in his brevity. His sentences are short, crisp, and unshowy. Few of his words are wasted. A delight these days. Thank you for joining me on the conversation. Welcome, Russell.
Hey, Paul, thanks. I'm happy to be here.
So, Smalltime. Tell us a little bit about Johnstown, Pennsylvania, and your family's long connection to that town.
Johnstown is my hometown. It's in the southwestern part of the state. It's about an hour and a half drive from Pittsburgh, and it's always kind of in the orbit of Pittsburgh. A steel town. That's what its claim to fame always was, which means it's now a rust town.
Yeah.
And has been for a long time. So it was in its heyday in the early and mid 20th century. Its population got as high as close to 70,000, and it's now less than 20,000. So it's really shrunken. But I always say it's a great place to be from. It's a very mixed, ethnically mixed place, and my people, if you want to speak in those terms, got there. My father's family is Sicilian, and they emigrated when the millions did at the turn of the century, looking for a way out of poverty. And my great-grandfather went there. He got a job in the coal mines, and along with my great-grandmother, and they started this brood. And the next generation, their son, he what can I say? His life sort of encompassed the trajectory of the American mafia. So he was born and and reared during Prohibition. He was selling bottles of hooch, on the street, and his mother made it in a still in their living room. They were working for a kind of neighborhood proto-mob figure. And then from that, once Prohibition ended, just as happened in small and large cities all over the country, he shifted into gambling and started this whole kind of franchise.
Right. So you knew a little bit about this, but you were putting your skills and your talent as a writer to history, to 17th century, to the Dutch in New York, but also to Amsterdam in the Netherlands, where you lived for a while. Your earliest book was on Jesus, and you wrote stories about biblical history and a book about the saints. You were kind of reluctant to take this on. Tell me about Frankie and meeting up this old family person when you were on a visit, I think for Christmas several years ago.
Yeah, I think all families have things that they don't talk about, and yet somehow the kids just come to know about them. And that was the case with my grandfather. Somehow I knew that my grandfather, and namesake, as you said, was some kind of mob guy in town. But I internalized this kind of vow of silence. Wasn't really that, but I didn't think about it really, because you weren't supposed to. And therefore, even once I became a writer of narrative history, it never really occurred to me that would be a subject. And I think if it had, I would have pushed it aside simply because I would have said, well, I write nonfiction, and I know those guys didn't keep notebooks, so there's no sources. Then several years ago, I was home, as you say, visiting over Christmas. And so it's my father's father that I'm talking about, who was the mob figure. And so my mother's cousin had worked for him as a numbers runner, and he had a job in the pool hall, and he had left town. Everybody who stayed in town had kind of kept this, we don't talk about that mentality. But Frank was a jazz singer. He moved to Las Vegas when he was about 20 and had his whole career there. And so then when he's retired, he was pushing 80 at this time. And he came back, and he was playing at a club that night. And so a group of us went down to the club to see him. And in a break between the sets, he said to me, and we're all standing around, all these people, like mostly older relatives who live in the town and don't talk about that. He looks across at me and kind of wags his finger and says, "Russell, you're the writer. What are you going to do about the story?" And I said, "What story?" And as soon as I said it, I knew what he meant. And he said, "Your grandfather, the mob." And they all kind of, I could feel them, shrink, because, you don't talk about that. But for Frank, these were golden memories. He just remembered his childhood and all the, he told me it was the day he got a job working for the boys, he said, was the happiest day of his life. So he was the one who really made it conscious and got me started. And then,
but even let me stop you, but you were kind of reluctant. He came back a couple times. You sort of kept saying, pushing aside, right? You didn't immediately say, yeah.
He kept pushing. And I was saying, look, I write stuff that happened hundreds of years ago. I don't write this. And maybe, I just didn't want to look into myself like that, into my family. But I also had this conviction that there's not enough stuff there, and so finally, though, he pushed enough that I said, all right, I'm going to go back home and I'll spend a week just seeing what's there.
Right.
And he said, all right. I told him, Frank, I'm here. And he said, okay, meet me at my hangout. And his hangout is Panera Bread.
That's what I love. That's a recurring thing, that the Panera gang.
Yeah. So I met him at Panera, and I turned on my recorder, and I figured he's just going to tell me some stories. And pretty soon another old guy comes up, and then another one comes. And soon there were like 7 or 8 guys around us, and they're all like leaning on their canes and things. At 4 hours later, Paul, I turned off the recorder, and, I said, all right, this is something. I had 4 hours worth of stories. Now, as you know, you're a journalist. stories from guys reminiscing about 60 years ago, I don't know. I mean, that's interesting. That's something to go on, but I can't rely on that. So the next step was to see what else I could find to see if it holds up. So I filed the FBI Freedom of Information Act requests, and my dad was friends with the chief of police in town. He gave me access. He gave me the key to their archive room.
That's great.
And so, slowly
Right.
I put together, I realized that since the Panera guys had given me, I ended up doing a couple hundred hours worth of interviews. But those interviews were the kind of heart of this.
Right.
But I also had a skeleton to go with it. I had a real firm structure of
And you
what
get into
happened.
that in detail in your acknowledgments, which I'll get to. But I should say you're also a journalist. I mean, you're a contributing writer to the New York Times Magazine. You've written many long form journalism, so you have high standards for the truth and for verification. And this is what you were doing. I mean, you were buttressing what they were telling you and checking it out, right? You were confirming things as much as you could. So, but the other thing is what you talk about, you actually apologize in a way at the end, the acknowledgments, if you hurt anyone in your family, because it is private, like you said, many ways. So was that a hurdle, even when you said, I think there's a story there, was that still something that pulled at you, like this is too private to write, or?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know that I had a whole lot of reservation myself, as far as I'm concerned. Um, Early on in the project, I realized that I could only do it if my father wanted to do it with me. My father was my grandfather's oldest son, and I think he was probably the person most affected in all kinds of ways by that activity that happened back then.
Right.
And my father has always been a very open person, and he was a big AA guy, and he would say, "You're only as sick as your secrets." So when I asked him, does he want to do this? And he immediately said yes, knowing, I think, that there were going to be things that would be hard for both of us, especially for him. So he was my guide.
Right.
There are a couple of people in my family who I knew from the beginning were not so keen on this. I have done my best to talk to them and to involve them. I have talked to other people who've written memoirs, because ultimately this becomes not just a history, but a memoir, a family memoir. I've talked to other people who've written memoirs, and they say, that is a hard thing, and maybe it doesn't, maybe you can't kind of bring these people around in your family who don't want to do this, but ultimately you have a right to tell your story.
Right.
And the fact that it overlaps with theirs, you can try to disentangle it a bit, but that's a decision you have to make. And that goes for me, that goes for anybody who wants to explore their family.
So let's talk about, there's sort of also another level to it. You've written and you talk about in the book, your relationship with your father was somewhat strained, but was this working with him and sort of getting to this story, was that cathartic at all? Did that repair that relationship in some way?
Yeah, I mean, I talked about it. It's kind of hard to, summarize in
Right.
a chat, but I spent some time in the book talking about it. It wasn't strained in the sense that we always were in touch, but I guess it's typical of a lot of people when they become adults, you have a certain distance from your parents. And so there was a source, there was something in between us throughout my adulthood. And in working on this book, I slowly came to realize that whatever that was, it was back there.
Right.
The source of it was in this area that we were digging into. And so finally, yeah, it became very cathartic for me, very, emotional, because I was thinking I was getting at my grandfather, and to some extent, the relationship between my grandfather and my father, but ultimately it also became about the relationship between my father and me.
Right. I mean, really a 3-generation story. Talk about, and you do in the book, I mean, Sicilian, but Italian culture has often been kind of, mischaracterized or racist in some ways with the organized crime. We have a great little museum of Italian American culture here, and that's something that they're quite sensitive about in the exhibit. Talk about that issue with the subject matter.
Well, I know, I think purposely, because I was aware of this mob connection in my past, my family's past, I always avoided mob stuff. I never wanted to see Godfather or Sopranos or any of that, until suddenly then I became I wanted nothing but to dig into this. And I was surprised at the extent to which it came out of American discrimination. I mean, here you have, first of all, America says, please come, we want you to do these jobs that we don't want to do.
Right.
So millions of people come. And then America turns around and says, we don't like you people, and we want to keep you in, you're going to stay in a company town, and
right.
And we're going to tell you what you can and can't do. And so people were very restricted in what they could do. This is, set in the 20s, teens, 20s, 30s. People who were of especially Southern Italian heritage. And so you put that together with the people of my grandfather's generation were then taught, they went to school in the US and they were taught to admire the American way, and these, the robber barons, the people like Frick and Carnegie and Astor and Ford, and they were basically people who did what they wanted, and they bribed politicians and they got their way. So on the one hand, they're told to admire that. On the other hand, they're restricted from, rising in the system. And then here comes prohibition, and here's a revenue stream, an income stream.
Right.
Here's a whole industry that you can kind of create. So that's how it basically happened. My grandfather, as I say, was part of that. So, I'd grown up with this sense of my grandfather as this dark figure who was, he did a lot of bad things in my family, to my family. So I had good reasons for feeling that way about him. And so the strange thing was that in the course of doing this research, I came to have some sympathy for him, because when you see him from that historic perspective, what choice did he have? He's a kid on the street, and some guy says, here, sell this stuff for me. And, so he starts working. That's how he worked his way up,
Right. And no better person than Francis Ford Coppola. I was amazed. You got this beautiful, very generous blurb testimonial from Francis Ford Coppola, who obviously made the Godfather films and has dug deeply into this subject. He said mixes great history and lovingly lingering memories. And he just goes on talking about the Italian American legacy and how your book informs that. But one thing I like about your grandfather and his group, his crew, they were clean mobsters, in that they did not take on prostitution and drugs, which was a common form in the rackets and stuff. Talk about their standards in terms of other organized crime.
Yeah, the center of the story is my grandfather and that story in the town. But the larger story that I was really interested in, and that I try to tell to some extent, is the story of the small town mob in America, which people don't know much about. They know New York and they know Chicago. Now, thanks to William Kennedy, there's people have this sense of Albany, and that towns of that size.
And Schenectady had the DeCocos. That was a famous, family.
So right. So that's that wider story of the mob and its spread in the country is what my story is part of. Johnstown was just another Schenectady or Scranton or Fresno or wherever. It was everywhere. So that's what these guys were doing. And I think that it's a difference between smaller towns and larger ones, that they shifted from booze to gambling, and they stayed with that. And a lot of the old boys told me they had a strict policy, no drugs. They thought that was dirty. They didn't want to go there. And I couldn't find any evidence to the contrary. As far as I know, as long as they ran this in town, they were doing gambling. Now, in addition, in order to do that, they were bribing politicians, bribing the cops. They were manipulating political races locally, so they were doing stuff, but there wasn't drugs and there wasn't prostitution.
And you have a great picture of him in the beginning of the book. He doesn't look like a mobster. He looks kind of like soft. He's not a big man. His wife looks beautiful. But you talk, he was kind of soft-spoken. He wasn't, threatening. And I mean, describe him physically and what his demeanor was like. And
physically, he was kind of a bearish guy. I always think, I don't know if you think from that picture, to me, he always kind of looked a little bit like Babe Ruth. He was, all the guys I talked to, because I only knew him there was probably, I don't know, 5 times or something that I was ever around him when I was a kid. Partly because he and my father had they didn't speak for years. But everybody told me that he was very quiet. And some people said maybe he was even almost pathologically shy, and he would just mumble a few words or a few orders or something. And at the same time, he was a very serious drinker, and that problem got worse and worse. And that became his undoing. And I wonder if the drinking wasn't a way to overcome the shyness. And other people said this to me, that suddenly when he was drinking, that's when he was telling you that he loved you and, right, that kind of thing. So a funny kind of personality to be running an organization. He did this, I should say, with his brother-in-law. Together, my grandfather became a small town gambler and card sharp. He was a real expert cheat. And so he knew the town at that level. This other guy then comes from the mob in Philly and marries my grandfather's sister. And that's how they joined forces. So he brings kind of the imprimatur, and my grandfather knows the lay of the land, and together they built the operation.
And their methods, you described some of them, like dealing off the bottom of the deck, loaded dice, little things. But it wasn't like they had Tommy guns and all. I mean, it was a kinder, gentler organized crime in a way. It wasn't physically torturing, killing. We'll get to the one murder that's kind of murky at the center of this. But what were their tactics?
I think the point there about violence is another point related to the small town nature of it. This all happened pretty much in the open. Everybody over a certain age who I interviewed in town knew them. I mean, I could walk up to somebody in the street and say, did you know these guys? If they were like 75 years or older, they would say they knew the name, the numbers game that they played. Half the town played it, and they knew who they were. They knew where they operated out of. It was wide open. I think that was only the case because there wasn't a lot of overt violence. Had there been shoot-ups and things like that in a small town, then you just can't get away with that. Then it would all come down on you. So yeah, I talked to a couple of their enforcers, and the guy would say, yeah, I'd go. Some guy ran out on a bet, and he'd go run off to Pittsburgh to hide out. They're like, we know you're in Pittsburgh, so they'd send him there. And they'd smack him around, and eventually the guy'd pay up, and that's kind of how it went.
So tell me about Pippi, and I forget his last name, but he just a classic character in this whole story.
Their gambling, the gambling was what they were in business doing, and there were many different sides to it. At the center of it was their numbers game. They also ran card games for the big shots in town. They had craps games around town. They had something called tip seals, which was kind of like a lottery. where it was a board, as it was described to me many times. I've never seen a picture of it, but it was like a board with these little kind of like tickets on them, and you would buy one for a dime or $1, and you'd rip it off. And if your number matched the number underneath, then you won that amount.
Yeah.
So that was a big thing. And they had sports bets,
Okay.
especially in those days. I think boxing and baseball were the big thing, and then later football, and horse races, of course.
Right.
And this guy, Pippi DeFalco, was a bookie, a sports bookie, who worked for them. And then after a time, he would go off on his own. Then he would come back and work for them. And he kind of created problems by, he had boundary issues, I guess you would say. And so right then in the smack in the center of my story, Pippi gets murdered. First, he goes missing. He's murdered in February 1960, and the body is discovered in April. So during that whole time, you see the newspaper, where's Pippi? What happened to Pippi? And then more and more of the town is involved. And this coincides with the whole Pippi saga. Suddenly you have a murder in town, coincides with JFK coming into the White House. Bobby Kennedy becomes the Attorney General with this mandate. He's going to crack down on the mob. And suddenly you have the Attorney General of the United States communicating with the mayor of this little Pennsylvania town, saying what's going on there, and sending in the FBI. So that was a point at which the little story of my grandfather and these guys in my hometown dovetails with what's going on at the national level. And that was really then the beginning of the end for Russ, my grandfather, and that operation. I mean, it continued for a number of years, but
there was no real resolution to that homicide, right? Was there?
It's never been solved. He was murdered. They think with an ice pick, stabbed in the chest. So classic stuff here.
Yeah.
And the body was dumped in the river, and then it was found way downriver much later. And it's never been solved.
Yeah. So talk about the techniques. Like I said, I first met you in Albany with these 400-year-old documents, and here you're getting a lot of oral history, and you're trying to back it up, and you go to some length with your sourcing and your acknowledgments and description, that you try to have that same rigor, but it wasn't always possible with some of this. Tell me about just the technique of unearthing all these layers, and then checking out that the stories were factual. And
well, you're a journalist, you know how this works. If somebody tells you their car was red, okay, their car was red, you can accept that. But if somebody tells you something controversial or iffy, if you're going to print it, you have to get a second independent source on it.
Right.
And I tried to operate along those lines. So if somebody was going to tell me, and the example that I gave in the back of the book when I was discussing my methods was, my father and my aunt told me that my grandfather never carried a gun in his life.
Right.
Well, then somebody told me, no, he never left. He always had a gun on him. So then I'm like, well, this is an interesting disparity. I didn't know what to do with it. And then later, another interviewee who knew him at a different part of his life said, Russ always had a gun on him. So I put that together, and I've got two independent sources telling me this. What do I do with the fact that my dad never saw that? Well, it's not surprising maybe that he didn't want to show his son. Right. But I've got two sources, so I can kind of just state that he, packed a gun.
Right.
And so I tried to go that way. Now, this is also memoir. And so I allowed myself places where if my dad is giving me some memory of his, I'll quote him, and I just give that. And I don't feel the need to verify that necessarily, that memory of him with his parents when he was a kid or something like that. Right. So I did kind of try to combine those two elements.
Right. So when you mentioned you had a few interactions and met your namesake, your grandfather, what do you recall of those? How young were you, and what stuck with you from those encounters?
I guess the most memorable, I was probably 5 or 6 years old. So he had as I said, he was progressively a worse and worse drinker. And he was also a terrible philanderer who had children with other women around town. And really, those are the ways in which he really wreaked the most havoc within my family. Right. I mean, in a way, they couldn't have cared. They wouldn't have cared that he was, running a mob outfit. Right. But understandably, those are the things that really were hard for people. And by the time I was really aware, he was on the outs, and he was, and he was ostracized by my family too. My grandmother had kicked him out, and so we didn't know him. So I was with my mother downtown one day on the street, and this old man in a gray suit is kind of shambling up, and I immediately knew who it was. So I must have seen him, a number of times right around then. And he stopped, and they talked a little bit, and he kind of mumbled. And the main thing I remember is he had this big, heavy wristwatch, and he took it off his wrist and put it on my wrist. And even that gesture was kind of scary to me. And it's like, that's not appropriate. Here's somebody who does things that are inappropriate, was I think what I took from it.
You write that scene in the book, and it's beautifully written. In terms of the writing, as that reviewer in the Wall Street Journal said, it's compressed, it moves, it doesn't waste space. Talk about the difference or the challenge, or maybe it was freer than writing, history, the island at the center of the world, not ancient history, but long ago history. And now you're writing about fairly contemporary and your own relationship to this person in this story. Did that free you up? Did that make it more difficult? Did it?
Yeah, it definitely freed me up. It was a fun change of pace to write. I mean, I think I was channeling a little bit, the sort of noirish kind of prose, detective stuff. Because for one thing, these old guys, who I interviewed and things, they really talk that way.
I love it. I mean, they're in Panera. They're these former tough guys. There's a little bit of like either Cocoon or a feeling of like, the Over the Hill gang, but they still got great stories and great material. But they're kind of funny too, because they're sort of sweet. They don't seem menacing or. But
that delivery and that, so that style of theirs, I tried to. It wasn't hard. I think I automatically, when I started writing, started doing a little of that. And so then it tightens your sentences, you get a little punchy with your descriptions. And I'm hoping that a reader can see that that's what I'm doing. And that's what I liked about the cover on the book, that it's that it has that kind of feel of sort of pulp fiction, cheap detective novel feel. Right. And that, by the way, is Main Street in my hometown. And that where you see where it says club under the S, that's the building that was City Cigar, which was that was their hangout. That was the base of their operation, their headquarters.
But it wasn't that big, right? It wasn't a large number of people. Or how big was his crew, do you think, when they were?
Well, I mean, they said, people told me there were about 100 people working for the numbers game.
But that's a kid just running.
Yeah, that's not. Yeah, it could be somebody who just does it for a couple hours after work or whatever, But yeah, then how many people he had working full time, I don't know. He had his niece, my dad's cousin, who I interviewed several times before she died. She was their accountant, and they had guys they had guys in the office money guys and accountants and then they had all these different multifarious gambling operations, but then they had legitimate businesses too. And the way that seemed to work was they would put, say, their pinball machines in a bar, and you would also gamble on pinball, and you would split the take with the house. And maybe later then the owner of the bar needs money for his kid's college or he's behind on his rent. So they would front him that. And then maybe they would do it again. And then they'd say, well, we'll do it this time in exchange for a piece of the business. Right, so, right. You get your fingers around, you've read William Kennedy, you know how this works.
Of course. And the fact that they never got shut down because they bought off the politicians and the cops and everything.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I talked to the former DA who was a judge in town, who not during their time, he was sort of the next generation, but he was around during their time. And he told me, sort of chapter and verse how it worked and how they paid off. And, I think it was about once a month, they would have to raid the place for form's sake. So they'd call them in advance and let them know they were coming. And there would be a guy that they would get who was usually an older guy who's kind of down on his luck. And they'd leave him there with some of the tickets and things to take the fall, so he'd go spend a night in prison or whatever, and that was all, it was just, as I say, in the open, and that was the system.
Right. How do you define the term mob? Because in reading your book and thinking about it, the Albany Democratic machine, even though it was political, was kind of an organized crime. It was a racket. They controlled some of these same, illicit activities that you described. So what is a mob? Is it a union? Is it a bunch of hoodlums and criminals?
That's a good question. I'm not, I've done a few years of work on this. I'm not truly, I spent time with people who are, who study the mob for a living. So I'm not that. But the whole, you mentioned the term organized crime, and I found that fascinating. The standard textbook which is called Organized Crime, is by a guy named Howard Abedinsky. And he goes into this interesting, he basically says that the term organized crime, I'm paraphrasing here, of course, came into being when people who were sort of in the establishment doing, activity that you might think of as questionable, decided to look at ethnic gangs and say, no, what they're doing is illegal. So it had this ethnic slur, this discriminatory aspect to it,
right.
which goes back to, a thing that struck me in researching this, the extent to which these guys, the Southern Italian mob guys who proliferated around the country, emulated and looked up to American business and American capitalists. I mean, their tactics were very similar.
Yeah, I mean, I think the Robin Hood and the GameStop people would call Wall Street an organized crime, a racket.
Exactly. Yeah. And the authors of books on the subject, that's what they basically do, is say, these are rackets. They've just, bought enough politicians that it's legal for them.
So you also talked about how you, and it is, I would call it an affectionate portrait in a way. You obviously, as an author, like this guy, and I'm reading it and I'm sort of like this guy a little bit, even though, did some bad things. But what do you hope readers take away from it? I mean, you're not glorifying a criminal enterprise. I mean, what do you want readers to take from this?
It's a story of my family and of 3 or maybe 4 generations of males in my family that, in a way, tracks the story of American immigration. I go to my great-grandfather, so starting from the old country to America, what that generation endured, what the next generation endured, which was quite different, but it was still a very harsh discrimination. And that then spawned this whole kind of underbelly. And then, it gets into the relationship between my grandfather and my father. And my father is very much of the 50s and 60s and 70s. That's when he was in his prime. But those forces that started with the generation coming were still at play and still alive between them. And it's still, and this extreme difficulty between that father and son, between my father and his grandfather, that years living in the same town, they didn't speak. That the roots of it go way back. At the same time, it's this classic male inability to articulate. And had they done so, I mean, I think so much would have changed, but instead they just stayed locked in their selves. And then that carried ultimately to the relationship between my father and me. So it's a long-winded way of saying, I think it's an American story. I think it's an immigrant story. I like to think of myself first and foremost as a storyteller. And so if somebody reads it and says that was a good story, I'm happy with
It's
that.
beautifully written. And it is funny. That reviewer, I definitely see a lot of humor. There's a great line. You've done this long interview with an old timer, and it's actually at the end, and like, what was your name again? You know.
Right, right.
But if you have a copy handy, I want to ask one more question while you get one and read a small.
I happen to have one right here.
Perfect. I got mine right here. I keep this handy, signed by you right when it came out. This is
Oh, nice.
this is a
Hardcover.
career. This is a career, and then you've gone on to do 6 more or whatever. You're up to 7 now, but got it signed here. So whenever we can get together, I've got my whole Russell Shorto library signed. So my question, as you're finding what you want to read, so the steel mills, that was the whole purpose of the town, and they worked. And I know some of your family worked in the steel mills. Was this a response to being either laid off or, the steel mills, their time had passed, and that this was an enterprise to kind of lift them out of poverty? Or was this just like, hey, we can do better doing this illegal activity than going into the steel mills like our uncles and fathers and grandfathers? And
Are you talking about my grandfather's rise?
yeah.
Yeah, well, he was at that time, they were, he grew up with, as I said, he grew up with Prohibition. He was on the streets peddling moonshine.
Right.
And I don't know.
Did he ever work in the steel mills? And
he worked in the steel mill for a couple of years during World War II. And he did that, my dad knows he did that to get out of having to be sent abroad.
Right.
But at that time already, they'd already set up their operation in town. And so he was kind of minding the store. He had a pool hall and he was running that. And then he was working in the mill at the same time.
Oh, he was. So
That
I
was
was
his early
wondering
days,
if
yeah.
this was a response to either the terrible conditions or discrimination in the mills, but he was actually kind of this side hustle that grew into a whole enterprise, really.
Well, yeah, no, I think he started out with this hustling, and then he got the job in the mill to avoid going to war. But by then, he already knew his career path, and he was just doing the mill work to, get out of service so that he could set up his operation.
And he never did time in prison or anything for.
My dad and I did a kind of memorable father-son trip to the county courthouse where we requested and received a stack of our forebears' arrest warrants. So yeah, he did a number of he was arrested many times.
Okay.
So you want me to pick a place?
Yeah.
Okay.
I know you also got the FBI files, and I mean, you did a lot of archival research for this too.
Yeah. You want me to read for like 2 pages or something?
Yeah, that'd be great.
Should I just read the first? You know what? I'll start.
I like the opening, but whatever you.
I'll just start the second. Since we talked about the opening, I'll start at the second.
Okay.
This is chapter 2. It's called The Victim. I'm not sure whether it's obligatory for a mob story to have a murder at its center, but I realized quite early in my research that this one had one. I became obsessed enough by it that the victim, the excellently named Pippi DeFalco, whose murder has never been solved, became a presence in our house. What are you working on? My wife would ask. Pippi, I'd say, or Pippi's autopsy, or forensic speculation as to whether it's possible to determine for sure that it was actually an ice pick that Pippi was stabbed in the chest with, or just some generic thin pointed blade. Or Pippi's last day, one particular moment of which hovered in my mind. It hovers still. It's February 6, 1960, about 5 in the afternoon. Darkness is falling. The Chevy Bel Airs and Ford Thunderbirds maneuvering their wide bodies off Walnut Street onto Main are snapping on their headlights, making a sheen against the wet pavement. Saturday night is coming. Pippi DeFalco is limping across Main Street. The weather is sleety, temperature in the high 30s. Pippi's a small man wearing a big overcoat. He has an open face, puppyish eyes, shows lots of teeth when he smiles, kind of a goofy expression, which gives an impression of innocence. but that's misleading. People say there was always something else going on. Nice guy, his one-time partner told me, but not a nice guy. Pippi was what you would call a creature of habit. He left his home in the morning. He lived with his wife and infant son in an apartment in Morelville, one of the oldest sections of town, a neighborhood of steelworkers' houses and lots of churches, and drove along the river. On his right rose a steep wooded hill, at the top of which the town's rich families had their homes. On his left, he passed one of the 4 steel mill plants that powered the town's rise in the 20th century. Today, they're as silent as Greek ruins, but in Pippi's time, they incessantly poured smoke out of their high, skinny stacks. Every day, the smoke put a fresh red-gray coat of dust on all the cars in town, which nobody minded wiping off, because if the mills were churning, so was the town. Johnstown had just peaked as a small industrial powerhouse. The population of 53,000 was already on the decline. It hit its apex of 67,000 in 1920. But good blue-collar jobs were still plentiful, and there were a lot of managerial and professional types as well. Today, the city is largely hollowed out, with neighborhoods of boarded-up houses and a population less than a third of what it once was. In Pippi's time, it rocked. Shift workers crowding into the mill gates, the trolley cars full, housewives browsing the downtown storefronts.
Wonderful. Thank you, Russell. The book is Smalltime, A Story of My Family and the Mob by Russell Shorto. Just hearing you read that and reading it, I think you're at your best. I mean, it's so controlled and so beautifully written. I'm so glad that Frankie got you to Panera and you took on this assignment. Thank you for being part of the conversation, Russell.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you for making part of your series. Very much appreciated.
We look forward to getting you back to the Writers Institute in Albany when that's possible, because we love when you come. You always draw a huge crowd. We love you in Albany. Thank you very much.
That'll be great. Thanks so much, Paul.